Welcome to Vigorous Libido. I'm Coach Steve. Now, I understand that a lot of you still have problems with libido, even though I already made a video about it. So I'm going to give you guys a protocol, which I've been using with many of my clients and during consultations, on how to restore your libido when your hormone balance is completely off. Now, there's a few prerequisites in this situation, which have to do mostly with hormone use. So, this method is not going to work in every scenario, but in the scenario which we're going to describe, it's definitely going to work. So a lot of you think that by lowering your sex hormone binding globulin, your free testosterone is going to increase, right? Which is going to increase libido. Now, to a certain point that works, but not if you've been cycling for a very long time, or if you're on hormone replacement for a very long time. Remember, libido doesn't only work with free testosterone. It works with hormone balance. If your free testosterone is high, your estrogen should also be reasonably elevated. Now, a lot of men are still a little bit scared and like, oh, estrogen, it's the female hormone. Estrogen regulates libido more than testosterone does. And you'll see that with a lot of guys which have sky-high free testosterone levels, but low estrogen levels and low sex hormone binding globulin levels, is that their libido is still in the gutter. Now, this is an issue that most men don't understand, or not yet. Hopefully, by me posting this video, a lot more people will now understand that you need a balance between all these hormones, not just one sky high and the rest bottomed out. So, you're on hormone replacement, you're on cycle, you're using testosterone, hopefully not too many suppressive or progestogenic steroids like trenbolone or nandrolone or some of the funky designer steroids. Let's say you're on a moderate cycle, you're using testosterone, you've been on testosterone for a while, causing your sex hormone binding globulin to decrease. Again, sex hormone binding globulin delivers sex hormone to tissue. That's why it's called sex hormone binding globulin. Yeah. Sex hormone binding globulin delivers sex hormones to tissue, whether that's testosterone, DHT, estrogen, some of the anabolic steroids that people prefer to use. It delivers it to tissue and it potentiates some of its effects through the androgen receptor or through the estrogen receptor on gene transcription, eventually resulting in libido. Yeah, there's many in-between processes, but it will eventually result in libido. Again, keep in mind that stress levels need to be reduced and caloric intake need to be reasonably high because those are going to determine libido as well. So if your stress is sky high, your caloric intake is very, very low and your hormone balance is off, even fixing your hormone balance is not going to restore your libido to its maximum potential, so to say. So you still need to reduce your stress, increase your caloric intake because, hey, sex and making babies is a calorically demanding activity. So your caloric intake needs to be high. Yeah, just look at it from a logical perspective. Stress needs to be reduced and caloric intake needs to be high. Now, what can we do to increase our hormone profile and hormone balance? You've been on hormones for a while. Your testosterone's high. Hopefully you keep your estrogen at the top or slightly over the reference range. Again, it's a balance and a ratio between testosterone and estrogen. I prefer 13 to 18 to 1, so 13 to 18 times your total testosterone levels in nanograms per deciliter to 1 on your estrogen in picograms per milliliter. Again, all these concentrations, are slightly different, but 13 to 18 to 1 on estrogen is usually a good range. So that means if your testosterone levels are reasonably elevated, your estrogen should also be reasonably elevated to a certain degree, because over 75, maybe even 100 picograms per milliliter, you'll start to notice things like gynecomastia, acne, water retention, that kind of stuff. So side effects. So safely, you could increase your serum estrogen levels to maybe 55 to 60 picograms per milliliter. Again, it's highly dependent on the individual and what other compounds you're using. But what I've noticed with myself and many clients, there's no side effects regarding gynecomastia or acne or water retention around 55, 60, sometimes even 75 picograms per milliliter. Again, it's your decision on how high you want to let your estrogen climb. You can either reduce your aromatase enzyme dose, increase your testosterone dose if you're not using any aromatase enzyme inhibitor and let that freely convert. Or make sure you don't use things that are known to reduce dehydroboldenone metabolites, Masteron, Proviron, Primo, some of the DHT compounds, they always have some sort of reducing effect on the aromatase enzyme, reducing the conversion from testosterone to estrogen. So keep all those things into consideration. Testosterone high, estrogen should also be high. Now, the longer you stay on cycle, the more depleted your DHEA, DHEA sulfate, pregnenolone, and pregnenolone sulfate levels are going to be. Because you downregulated your HPTA, right? Your hypothalamus pituitary testis axis. You've downregulated that entire process by taking exogenous hormones. Your LH is low, luteinizing hormone, and your follicle stimulating hormone is low. Now, your follicle stimulating hormone can stay low because it's mostly related to semen production. Again, you're on hormone replacement. Semen production is not going to be 100%, but it should still fall within fertility levels. By taking testosterone, LH is automatically downregulated, and it's not going to go up unless you do PCT or you take something like a triptorelin or Clomid during your cycle, which is only going to temporarily increase your LH levels. You can also take synthetic LH in the form of ACG, and this is the protocol we're going to discuss. By temporarily taking ACG on cycle, not in a long period of time, because you still risk desensitization to a luteinizing hormone. So you take ACG on cycle when libido is off to restore your hormone balance. Your testosterone is high probably. You're managing your estrogen, hopefully into this correct ratio of 13 to 18 to 1. But your DHEA and pregnenolone and the sulfate attachments are both out of range or, below the favorable range. ACG works on the testicles, because it has LH receptors, but the adrenals also have LH receptors. So DHEA and pregnenolone are predominantly produced in the adrenals as well in the brain, the rest of the brain, because they're neurosteroids. So they work in the brain and potentiate a lot of their cognitive, mood, and libido effects in the brain because they're produced there. Now, since the adrenals, the adrenal glands also respond to luteinizing hormone, and that's completely downregulated. There's no LH in your bloodstream whatsoever when your HPTA is downregulated. The production of DHEA and pregnenolone is reduced. Now, you'll see on blood work that they're probably still in range, but they're not at the top of the range. Just like your testosterone is at the top of the range and your estrogen is at the top of the range, your DHEA, DHEA sulfate, pregnenolone, and pregnenolone sulfate also need to be at the top of the range to maintain this hormone balance, because libido is mostly regulated by hormone balance, not by one of these hormones being sky high and others being at the bottom of the reference range. So you need to have everything at the top of the reference range once you start going on steroids, especially when you go on cycle. The easiest way to restore DHEA, DHEA sulfate, pregnenolone, and pregnenolone sulfate is by taking synthetic LH in the form of ACG. Now, what I've noticed with myself and many of my clients, 1,000 units of ACG every other day for 2 or 3 weeks is more than enough to completely restore libido. Now, when you take synthetic LH in the form of ACG, it starts working on the testicles, obviously, by you start producing testosterone, estrogen, DHEA, pregnenolone, and some of the intermediate hormones. But it also works in the adrenals, and there it produces DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate, which are technically not bioavailable because they've been turned into sulfate, which is basically an ester, just like testosterone enanthate or testosterone propionate. This is not bioavailable, and the ester needs to be cleaved off. Same as DHEA sulfate. The sulfate needs to be cleaved off before you reach free serum DHEA levels, which can be used either through the sexual binding globulin or through albumin. It's still bound to something in most cases, and free DHEA or free pregnenolone levels are significantly lower than total DHEA sulfate or total pregnenolone sulfate levels. But in the case when you're on steroids, all these levels are going to be depleted, and the DHEA and pregnenolone sulfate levels need to be elevated as a buffer for free DHEA and free pregnenolone levels to circulate throughout the blood. So you want to keep those levels high. And by taking ACG, you'll see the fastest increase in DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate levels in serum, which will then increase free DHEA and free pregnenolone levels, which will then contribute to libido. Now, I know that DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate have some benefits in the brain, mostly, again, when it has to do to cognition. But it's mostly the free DHEA and free pregnenolone that contribute to the libido. So if you want to speed up this process, you can take supplemental DHEA and supplemental pregnenolone and increase your free DHEA and free pregnenolone levels through supplementation. So you take the HCG to increase the sulfate form of these hormones, and you supplement to increase your free forms of these hormones. Now, when your libido has been restored and you stop taking HCG, maybe 2 or 3 weeks later, you still keep taking DHEA and pregnenolone to keep your DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate levels elevated, because they can freely transform in between each states. Now, the DHEA sulfate and the pregnenolone sulfate are not bioavailable, but free DHEA and free pregnenolone are bioavailable and potentiate some of their effects on gene transcription that way, similar to how testosterone enanthate cannot attach to the androgen receptor and potentiates its effect on gene transcription. So cannot DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate. So by keeping DHEA and pregnenolone in supplemental form, you keep your free DHEA and free pregnenolone levels elevated as high as it can be. And even though the adrenals are not producing so much DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate anymore, since they can freely transform between each state, both the free state of these hormones and the sulfate state of these hormones are both staying at the top of the reference range, which will match the top of the reference range estrogen that you have and the elevated or severely elevated levels of total testosterone and free testosterone that you have. So this complements and completes a favorable hormone balance for a good libido. And it's as simple as that. It's really as simple as that. You start with the HCG, 1,000 IUs, maybe 2,000 IUs, depending on how long you've been on cycle and how depleted your DHEA and pregnenolone levels are. And maybe your estrogen levels are severely depleted as well. So you have to go by blood work and see how much HCG you actually need to bring your hormone levels back up again. And you can either do that through supplementation or by, taking additional HCG, which will increase your levels a little bit faster and higher in that sense. 1,000 to 2,000 IUs of HCG every other day worked well for me, most of my clients, and most of the people that I've consulted with, given that stress and caloric intake is managed. And within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, libido is completely back to normal, or maybe high normal. I'm not sure where it was before, but that's where you ideally want it to be. You want it to be a high normal libido, where you're happy, your partner is happy. Again, it depends on how much libido you can tolerate, how much your partner or partners can tolerate. I'll leave that in your hands. You can decide how much libido is too much and discontinue the HCG prior. So now that the hormone balance has been restored with HCG, you'll still have to manage it accordingly by managing your testosterone dose, making sure that you still have sufficient amount of estrogen by limiting aromatase inhibitors, or maybe using alternatives like dinyl methane or calcium glucarate to keep your estrogen in a favorable range. And then you keep the supplemental DHEA and pregnenolone in to keep the free DHEA, free pregnenolone, and DHEA sulfate and pregnenolone sulfate levels elevated to complement this libido favorable hormone balance. During the time that you're using HCG, you can incorporate some of the supplements that you would use during a PCT protocol in order to, restore this hormone balance a little bit faster and complement, the processes that HCG is going to start, like testosterone production and estrogen conversion and DHEA and pregnenolone production. So those, off the top of my head, is going to be taurine, carnitine, zinc, magnesium, vitamin D3, selenium, and cholesterol, which are all used in the production of sex hormones. So you got to make sure that those building blocks and those micronutrients are present when you're using HCG, and preferably also afterwards, just to complement the whole process. Now, cholesterol doesn't really have to be supplemented because your body produces a decent amount of it by itself. And depending on what you're using, you're either producing more cholesterol in the liver, causing it to float around. So let's say your total cholesterol levels are a little bit elevated. HCG will actually utilize some of this serum cholesterol into the production of testosterone, DHEA, and pregnenolone, effectively lowering serum concentrations and perhaps reducing LDL levels as well. By increasing your estrogen levels, HDL should come up. So this whole protocol, from what I've seen on blood work, should improve lipid levels as well in the short duration of 2 weeks or 3 weeks. It won't bring it back to 100%, again, depending on what other compounds you're using in your steroid protocol. If you're using a ton of Winstrol, there are other compounds that are known to increase total cholesterol levels. A little bit of HCG is not going to be a magic cure-all fix for you. But if you're on hormone replacement and your total cholesterol is, for example, 220 milligrams per deciliter, your HDL is a little bit low and your LDL is a little bit high, by following this protocol, those levels will all improve. So by following this protocol, your lipid levels should improve, your libido obviously will improve, and your relationship quality should improve because you're putting that HCG to work within 2 or 3 weeks. I hope this helps. I'll put a little bit more detailed article on my website, VigorousSteve.com. You can find more information about this protocol there. I hope it helps. I hope I won't see any of these libido questions anymore in the comment fields, because this one is probably the easiest quick fix for anybody in a situation where testosterone is very high, but estrogen, DHEA, and pregnenolone are low. Again, it's not a quick fix for every libido or erectile dysfunction situation. Please give the other libido video a watch, because there's many factors that could contribute to poor libido or erectile dysfunction. And hopefully that video will send you in the right direction of having productive erections. Not just an erection, but it has to be productive for the reason why you're having an erection for. I think that makes sense. All right, I hope it helps. Leave me a like on the way out. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.